Thank you so much, Evie, and thank you everybody for joining us today. It's an honor to be learning Torah with you. It's an honor to be sharing some of the Torah of Rav Shagar with you. I'm guessing most of you have not had the chance to learn Rav Shagar's Torah before. He is somebody who is become more well-known in Israel the last couple of decades, but still is somewhat unknown in the English-speaking world, though I'm certainly one of the people trying to do my best to expose the English-speaking world to Rav Shagar, because I think he's a very important thinker, an individual rabbi, especially for the times that we find ourselves in. As Evie mentioned, I published a book recently on the essays of the thought of Rav Kook and Rav Shagar, who are two different thinkers, yet two very similar thinkers in certain ways, and that both are passionately consumed by the idea that our religiosity, our religious identity, and the modern secular world, which seems to so thoroughly contradict it, somehow have to be brought together as one. And to do that, it means obviously facing head on the questions and contradictions that emerge from being a religious person in the modern world, or the sometimes called we might call our age the postmodern world. What I so thoroughly appreciate about Rav Shagar, and I hope you'll get a sense of this both today and in the classes to come, is he is somebody who demonstrates an incredible emotional, intellectual courage. There is no question that he isn't willing to try to think through and engage. And at the same time, he has profound humility. So he will be the first to be honest if he doesn't have an answer. But that kind of intellectual, spiritual honesty and openness and commitment is something that at least I don't often find so much within the religious world that I exist in, at least as an Orthodox rabbi. And there's something very powerful about it and something very, very authentic about it. He is somebody who brings his full self to his Torah, and we'll see exactly how that plays out today. And if you bring your full self to Torah, then that is going to make you think differently about Torah and the many dimensions of our lives in which our religious identity expresses itself. Just to give you a little bit of a background on who Rav Shagar was, he was born in 1949, year after the establishment of the State of Israel. He died in 2007, relatively young from cancer. For most of his life, he was a Rosh Yeshiva, right? Sometimes Rav Shagar is described as a philosopher or something like that, but in truth, Rav Shagar was and would always think of himself as a Rosh Yeshiva. The yeshiva was his home. The Beit Midrash was the place where he spent his time, and that is the orientation he brought to his Torah. He's not an academic. He's not a philosopher, even though he cites many secular and academic sources. For him, his pursuit begins with Torah and ends with Torah, because that's what a Rosh Yeshiva does, right? The responsibility, the job of Rosh Yeshiva is to give shiur, to teach Torah, and that's what he tried to do. And what goes hand in hand with that is a sensibility when you are a Rosh Yeshiva, when you are a teacher, when you are an educator, that you have a responsibility to be attentive to the needs and questions of your students, right? A good teacher makes a space for their students to ask questions, and their teaching is attuned to those questions. Teacher feels a responsibility to provide answers for the questions that their students ask. And in that sense, Rav Shagar was very sensitive to sort of the needs and questions and queries of the generation in which he lived and of the students of which he served. He really sought for his Torah to be responsive to those challenges. Much of Rav Shagar's thought, again, revolves on these questions of the contradictions between being religious and being Zionist, right? These contradictions between Judaism and modern life. And the engagement with these contradictions leads Rav Shagar to try to rethink, again, sometimes even the most basic questions. What does it mean to have faith? What does it mean to pray? What does it mean to be a Jew? Now, in his lifetime, Rav Shagar was known within his world, the sort of certain segment of the religious Zionist world. Since his death, what has happened is that his students have gone on to publish a number of books, posthumous writings, posthumous publications of his writings. There's over 15 that have been published on many different topics and issues, and collected essays and commentaries. And they've really taken off. I mean, here in Israel, they've certainly captured a lot of people's attention. And this, again, goes to what makes Rav Shagar an important thinker, is that he is maybe the only religious Zionist or modern Orthodox thinker of the last, I would even say, 50 years, who has made a concerted effort to really think through the most difficult and profound questions and issues that being a religious person will face. And his writings are that struggle with that. And the reason that makes him so important is that even if you don't necessarily love his answers or like his answers even, at the same time, if you want a thinker who's addressing these kinds of questions, you really have almost nowhere else to turn. Or you're forced to turn back a century ago to find a thinker who might have sort of tried to grapple with these in their own time. So the very fact that Rav Shagar's Torah is sort of seeking to answer those questions everybody else seems to be avoiding is part of what I think speaks to the enduring nature of his writings. If you care about some of these questions, you got nowhere else to go. And it's good to grapple with what he's trying to say, because I think, like, as I said, he is saying something very, very important. And the last thing I'll mention just before we turn to sort of the text and get a better sense for who Rav Shagar was, I want to just start with a small teaching of Torah that in many ways you could say kind of captures Rav Shagar's his whole raison d'etre, his whole worldview, his whole intellectual project when it comes to Torah. So there's a midrash that Rav Shagar likes to cite based on the verse from Yirmiyahu, Hashem Elokechem Emet. Right? We're familiar with the verse because we recite it as part of the Shema, but it basically means the Lord God is truth. And what Rav Shagar appreciates is the fact that there is a connection, an equivalence made between God and truth. And the midrash actually goes on to say as follows: Lama mipnei shehu Elohim chayim. Right? Why is God called a God of truth? Well, the midrash answers, because God is also a God of life. Right? Torah describes God as Elohim Emet and Elohim Chayim. And Rav Shagar goes on to say, Emet she'ena emet chaya mafsika lihiyot emet. A truth that is not living stops being truth. Histam pitputin, right? It's just like sort of like silliness or banalities. Hi lo yechola lahafil et hachayim, right? A truth that is not a living truth can't actually act upon life. It's disconnected from life. Rak Elokim Chayim hu Elokim Emet. Right? Only a living God can be a God of truth. And what this gets at, and it's interesting, Rav Shagar doesn't say this, but we also, at least rabbinically, refer to the Torah with the same language. Torah is referred to as a Torat Chaim and a Torat Emet. Those are language that Chazal, the rabbis, use in many different circumstances, and the same idea would apply, right? The Torah can only be a Torah of truth if it is a living Torah, if it represents a truth that is connected to reality, that is something that you can actually experience in your own life. It's not a truth that lives in Shemayim. It's a truth that lives here on earth, right? As it says in Tehillim, the rabbis draw on this idea, me'eretz emet titzmach, right? That from the earth, truth will sprout. And Rav Shagar's project is very much one of getting people to recognize that for God to be a God of truth, God also has to be a living God, and for Torah to be a Torah of truth, it has to be a living Torah. And we'll see today how he tries to do that through the lens of his own experiences. So what we're going to do to frame sort of Rav Shagar, you almost might say Rav Shagar's origin story, we have to understand that in many ways it begins with the Yom Kippur War. Rav Shagar was born in 1949, so he is about 24 years old or so at the time of the Yom Kippur War. And he basically came of age as an adult with the Six-Day War in 1967 and the Yom Kippur War. Right? Those were two events within a short period of time with each other that really were impactful for him and his whole generation. Now, if you're familiar with Israeli history, right, the Six-Day War is a miraculous victory. It's a moment of unbelievable triumph, right? It's the moment where the Jewish people overcome all the odds to succeed, and there's a real sense that God's hand is in that victory. And what the Six-Day War unleashes, particularly in the religious Zionist community, is this sense of messianic euphoria, right? The return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel is the sign of the coming redemption and the victory of the Jewish people, not only in the War of Independence, but now in the Six-Day War, is just showing that future redemption is coming sooner and sooner, right? So profound euphoria at that time, not just in Israel, but around, really for Jewry around the world. Now, just several years later, right, what Israel encounters is the very opposite of the Six-Day War, right? They encounter really, I would say, the horrors and the traumas of the Yom Kippur War, right? And there are several reasons why the Yom Kippur, as euphoric as the victory of the Six-Day War was, that's how traumatizing the Yom Kippur War was, right? On the Yom Kippur War, Israel was attacked by surprise, and it was caught off guard, tremendously off guard. And on Israel's holiest day, or the Jewish people's holiest day, right, the air sirens went off, and as soon as people started to understand what was happening, there was a realization on that Yom Kippur that the Jewish state might come to an end, right? Both the Syrians coming in through the north and the Egyptians coming in through the south penetrated far quickly and far more devastatingly than anybody had even begun to be prepared for. The army was in many ways caught off guard. The government was caught off guard, even though they should have known better. And there was a lot of death and destruction in those first days of the war. And in those first days of the war, there was a real sense that maybe the state's not going to make it, which is something for us today that's almost hard to even wrap our mind around. And though Israel was able to push back the enemy armies over the next few weeks, there were a few thousand dead, several 10,000 injured at least, I think, and there were a few hundred Israeli soldiers who were now captive by enemy armies. And it was a very, very difficult situation for Israel to sort of move on from, right? The soldiers were caught off guard in the beginning days of the war. Many, many were traumatized. To the extent that Israel's only come to grapple with that trauma in recent years. There was actually a fictional recreation of those early days of the Yom Kippur War that was a television show here last year. I thought it was very, very powerful and profound because it just captured so strongly how off guard Israel was and just how devastating the attack was for them. And as you can imagine, for the religious Zionist community that was euphoric with the victory of the Six-Day War, thinking Mashiach is almost here, right? How then do you make sense of the traumas of the Yom Kippur? Yes, they won, but with such great cost. And whatever hope they had in the belief that the state could achieve these unbelievable things, after the Yom Kippur War, there was a realization that maybe some of that faith was misplaced. That the state is the army is not invulnerable and the state is not perfect. And from the religious perspective, this was a very, very difficult challenge to grapple with. And in many ways, the religious Zionist community didn't fully grapple with it, which remains to be one of its challenges. But I want to start first, before we look at how Rav Shagar responded to the war. And I should point out, Rav Shagar was a soldier in the war and had some very difficult and profound experiences in the war. But before we see his response, I want to show you what is the more sort of typical religious Zionist response to the war. And this comes from a collection of essays that were written by Rav Yehuda Amital. Rav Amital at the time was the founder and Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Etzion in Olon Shvut. And this collection of essays really captures sort of, I would say, the messianic religious Zionist thinking about the Yom Kippur War. And what it does, first and foremost, is argue that whatever death and devastation happened during the Yom Kippur War, even though it seemed to sort of indicate there were some real problems maybe with Zionism in the Jewish state, that really we don't have to worry about anything at all, right? Really, as we're going to see here, once redemption starts, there's no going back. And even if we hit a few bumps along the way, a few roadblocks, right? Sometimes you're on a long trip in your car and you get a flat tire, but you know what? You put another one on and you keep going and you get where you need to go. Right? That is essentially the narrative that Rav Amital offers here. Whenever bad things happen, don't worry about it. It's all going to work out in the end. So let me just read to you briefly how he describes it. This is from a section called The Meaning of the War. He says, "We are commanded to live with faith, and there is no turning back once the return to Zion has begun." Right, that's the argument here. Once the return, Shivat Zion, has begun, right? Once that path to redemption is open before us, there's no going backwards. It's only forwards. It's inevitable. He says there are temporary moments of hiddenness, but no retreat. Right? There's moments where we don't know exactly what God wants or what the plan is, but there's still no going backwards. All the paved roads and unpaved roads lead to the redemption of Israel. One must know from the start that the beginning of redemption comes in a rough and tumble fashion, as is hinted in the verse, the pains of Yosef. It comes according to the attribute of arousal from below, Isarusa dilatata, which just means through human efforts. The beginning of redemption comes with pain and sometimes by a circuitous route. One must know from the start that from every tragedy will go forth salvation. The land of Israel is acquired through suffering, but in this way it is truly acquired. So the religious narrative that Rav Mital is trying to paint here is, as I said, one of the inevitability of redemption. And he also notes that, yeah, there was death and destruction. There was some loss. There was some pain. There was some suffering. But that suffering inevitably is the catalyst or the impetus for salvation, for transformation, right? What he's playing into here is a certain messianic notion that you cannot have the transformation of the world without a few things having to get broken along the way, right? You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, right? If there's going to be a true transformation, there's going to be some pain and some things broken along the way. But as he says, that's the only way the land of Israel could truly be acquired. That's a statement by Chazal, by the rabbis. And again, this is his way of making sense of the Yom Kippur War. And it enables the religious Zionist community to continue to embrace the redemptive narrative and realize that story continues onward. The Yom Kippur War is just another, as I said, a bump in the road, a flat tire, but we get on and we keep going. Now, Rav Mital was a Rosh Yeshiva during the war. He actually he was a Holocaust survivor. He fought as a soldier in the War of Independence, but the Yom Kippur War, he's a Rosh Yeshiva. So he was not on the field, right? He is writing this to a certain extent from a distance, right? This is his theological analysis of the events that have taken place. But he says, if you want proof for this, right, you don't have to listen to me or look at the way I analyze sources. He actually does go to the front, at least at some point after a few weeks into the war, to spend time with his students. His students were called up from the Beit Midrash to go to war. And this is what he says: when you look at the students, when you hear them talk, you realize what I'm telling you is correct. And this is what he says. He says, when you listen to the conversations and reactions of the soldiers, who, because of their education, the name of heaven is known in their mouths, meaning because they're religious, they're going to talk in religious terms. When they slowly free themselves from external restraints and discover the throbbing faith in their hearts, even when their speech is stammering, you are filled with encouragement. He says, when you look closely at the soldiers, he's like, yeah, they've been through a lot. But as they're able to push forward and recognize the religious ramifications of all of this, even if their speech is sort of stammering at the beginning, they're eventually able to express clearly with, pure faith what is to come. He says, you're filled with encouragement and with confidence that you're looking forward to the great day. I mean, you hear the way they talk about this and their experiences and their faith, and you realize this is marching towards redemption, which we know will come. The day of searching for identity and returning to ourselves, and from there to the God of Jacob, right? The day of ultimate tshuva, when everything returns to the way it's supposed to be, especially the Jewish people and to God, right? That day is coming. And if you need proof, like I said, just look at the soldiers and the faith they're showing in terms of, in the aftermath of what they have experienced. Now, what's interesting, of course, Rav Mital and Rav Shagar actually became, I would say, somewhat close later in life. At this time, I don't believe they knew each other. And the reason I say that is Rav Shagar at the time was a younger student, a very respected student. He would go on in a couple of years to become a teacher at Yeshivat Kotel. But clearly Rav Shagar was not the kind of soldier that Rav Mital was talking to. Because Rav Shagar, in writing about his experiences and reflecting on his experiences, does not talk about it in the way that Rav Mital is. So we're going to get to Rav Shagar's reactions to the war, theological reflections on his experience. But before we do that, I want to just give you a little bit of a description of Rav Shagar's own experience of the war. And this is taken from an essay that he wrote many years later, but reflecting on what took place. So again, Rav Shagar's experience, very different from Rav Mital's. Rav Shagar was called up literally out of yeshiva, basically, I think on not the day of Yom Kippur, but the next day. Immediately he went to a base. When you get the orders, your Tzav Giyus or whatever, you're basically, tell you where to go. He showed up at the base, and he gets there, and he's immediately looking for the two other members of his tank crew. He served in a tank unit, He had two friends. Again, the yeshiva students went to the army together. They were Hesder students. So he knew the two others who served in his tank. One of them he was very close friends with. And they made an effort, the three of them, to try to stay together as a tank unit. Because what happened when they got to the base is that there was so much craziness going on that it wasn't even clear that that was going to be possible. They were basically just sending out guys to the front without any kind of seder or order, to it. But the unit wanted to stay together. They were friends. They knew each other. They felt it was going to be better that way, even amidst all the chaos happening at the base. And the next day, basically, they were sent out. They were sent out, I think it says 10 in the morning, to go to the front, the northern front, basically the Golan Heights, where the Syrian army, if you know the history of the Yom Kippur War, Syrian tanks made it basically all the way through the Golan Heights within a day or two. And as they came through, they left, like I said, devastation in their wake. They basically punched right through wherever Israeli forces were there, and they were stopped in one of the largest tank battles of the 20th century in the Golan Heights, basically. So anyway, Rav Shagar and his tank unit, when they finally get ready, they're sent to the front. And here's how he describes what happens on the way. He says, on the way at Rosh Pinah, so they're not all the way there, but they're getting close, there stood civilians who appeared to know better than us what was happening. Right? They're young soldiers. Nobody knows what's going on. They're driving up in their tank. It's totally disorganized. And they see a bunch of people by the road who basically start waving at the tank to get their attention. And he says they waved their hands and threw apples at us. Now, again, why are they throwing apples at them? It's not because they're like trying to be rude or anything like that. They're presumably throwing apples at them because they know that the soldiers were called up and probably haven't eaten and nobody knows what's going on. So they're trying to be helpful. And he says, I remember the discussion between Shmuel and Shaya, the two other members of his tank, his friends, about whether they should eat the apples. Now, what's the problem with eating the apples? Well, he says, perhaps they were from the Shemitah year. See, what happened is the Yom Kippur War, right? The previous year was the Shemitah year. Rosh Hashanah started the new year. So the question that they're dealing with is a halacha question, that if the apples were picked before Rosh Hashanah, they were picked from the Shemitah year, and these were presumably secular Israelis who were throwing it to them, and then if they were Shemitah apples, they can't eat them. So this was the debate, can we assume whether or not it was harvested, before or afterwards and all that kind of stuff. Basically, they were doing what yeshiva bachurim do all the time, which is they love debating, halachic questions. And he says it was a wondrous thing, these two who were going out to war, debating it, if it was permitted to eat these Shemitah apples. Rav Shagar sees this conversation as just like a beautiful thing. Like here they are, on their way to war, but their love of halacha, their love of Torah, they still want to be involved in these kinds of questions. He says their innocence reflects a certain idealism, without which the conversation would have been objectionable. Meaning it would have been completely disconnected from reality if it wasn't on some level a reflection of their own idealism that was taking place here, which Rav Shagar sees is very important. He says the fact that it was inspired by innocence granted the conversation a certain credibility and even beauty, and also a profound dveikut expressed in that moment. Dveikut means a sense of spiritual connection, religious joining with God. So they had this, Rav Shagar is recollecting this powerful moment of his two friends in this halacha conversation in the tank that really reflects for him a yearning of connection for things of ultimate value, Torah, God, halacha, and he sees something very profound in that. And what stands out for him is this moment and how it is contrasted by what is about to come next. Because literally they're hours or minutes from the front, from the battle. And Rav Shagar says, he says, the final memory. My last word with Shaya, when we got up close to Nafach is where they're going to engage the Syrian army. Even then, I didn't absorb the severity of the situation. Right? They still didn't really understand at all what they were walking into. But nevertheless, I asked Shaya, because he was the gunner, that if something happened, he should move the cannon so that it is not directly above the driver's compartment, so that in a case of need, I would be able to get myself free. I think Rav Shagar might have been the gunner. So the idea was he wanted to make sure that he wasn't going to be blocked if something happened to the tank and he needed to get out. He promised that he would do this, and these are the last words, the last memory I have of him, last memory of his friend, basically asking him, look out in case I need to get out, watch out for me. He says, the next thing I remember, I wake up and find myself in the driver's compartment full of smoke. The fire is what woke me up. With the remainder of my strength, I succeeded to free myself with the help of a hammer that I found. I stood several meters beside the tank, that was consumed by fire. But what had happened is the moment they entered the battle, their tank was hit and it exploded in flame. And Rav Shagar was knocked out. He sort of somehow wakes up in the midst of the smoke and the flame, and he's fighting for his life to get out of the tank. He says, he basically gets out, throws himself on the ground, and he says, I saw a giant flame the size of a house with several stories and was immediately struck by the association to Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. At the time, I didn't know what happened to Shai and Shmuel. Had they succeeded in freeing themselves, or perhaps they had been trapped in the tank? This was my parting picture of those boys. His parting picture was the image of the tank in flames. And again, when he says he has this moment of Akedat Yitzchak, right, that's a moment of, again, a total sense of whatever this is going on here is beyond him. He says, after I'd freed myself from the tank, Syrian tanks started to fire in my direction, still on the battlefield. So he somehow manages to run off, and he flees to an encampment that was there. He says part of their base that might have been abandoned. And he says he completely lost all sense of time. And more than this, I didn't even know I was burned. Rav Shagar burns up and down his arms. He was severely injured, but he was in shock, and he had no idea what was going on. He just managed to get out of the tank, get off the battlefield. He loses track of time. He doesn't really even know what's going on. And it's only several hours later, he hears the sound of an Israeli tank coming, and he goes out to see it. And it happens to be the person who's manning the tank is Rav Yaakov Medan, who actually goes on a couple decades later to become the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Etzion, where Rav Mital was the Rosh Yeshiva. I don't know if they knew each other at the time, but Rav Shagar and Rav Medan would go on to know each other for many decades. He was saved by him, and Rav Shagar was then flown to Maimonides Hospital to recover from his burns. And Rav Shagar's close friend, Rav Yair Dreyfus, who was the co-Rosh Yeshiva with him, of Yeshivat Siach Yitzchak, that's the yeshiva Rav Shagar founded a few decades later. Rav Dreyfus was also friends with Rav Shagar at this time. Rav Dreyfus goes to visit Rav Shagar in the burn unit at Maimonides, and Rav Dreyfus writes in his one of his essays how what he remembers more than anything is walking into the burn ward and just seeing people head to toe in bandages. Right, burn wards are not a pleasant place to be. Right, severe burns are just very difficult and painful and even ugly to recover from. And what he remembers is Rav Shagar weekly calling his name, and Rav Dreyfus turns towards him, doesn't even recognize Rav Shagar. He writes just because of the injuries, the bandages. And what he remembers is what Rav Shagar said to him, and Rav Shagar said to him is that the battlefield in real life is not like it is in the poems. Right, and what that acknowledges, and again we saw this even in the statement here, is the dissonance, right, the contradiction between sort of our innocence and idealism about the world and especially religious life, and what reality really is. That there's a big gap between those things, and the question is, what are we going to do with that? Now, for Rav Mital, right, his messianic narrative made sure there wasn't a gap. Right, there's death and destruction, but don't worry, we're still going in the right direction. For Rav Shagar, that gap, that contradiction, could not be so easily wiped away. I want to give you just a few more of the early, I would say, reflections of Rav Shagar on what he went through. And again, you'll see in his initial response to what happened, he fundamentally rejects not only Rav Mital's narrative of the sort of messianic, everything's going to be okay, redemption is coming. He also, I would say, even rejects some of the traditional language and thinking that religion often offers in these kinds of situations. Rav Shagar did not feel like the soldiers that Rav Mital described. And what we have to understand is that religious life often assumes a certain correspondence between faith and certainty, right? The more faith you have, the more certain you are about that faith, right? That's how we judge faith, is like by its strength, its intensity, its certainty. That's why we have this idea of emunah pshuta, simple faith, right? That it's pure, that it's not complicated, it's certain, it's absolute. Right? These are some of the the sort of basic religious ideas when it comes to faith. But Rav Shagar was not willing to say that faith has to be both simple and certain. That there's something about that kind of faith which is profoundly disconnected from life. And as we said before, if it's disconnected from life, it's not something that can necessarily be true. And I would say Rav Shagar is very concerned about the fact that the faith that offers itself as certain in the wake of death and destruction is a faith that may not be real at all. That it's a faith that is more of a defense mechanism as a way of covering up the traumas that have been experienced, rather than a faith that in some ways actually trying to grapple with them. So about 10 years after the war, Rav Shagar was part of a group of soldiers who had fought in the war and then went on to teach at a number of yeshivot, who came together to reflect on their experiences. And this is how Rav Shagar, already 10 years after, is responding to what took place. He says, I think that also in relation to the Yom Kippur War, on the one hand, the things, the events, everything that happened brings a lot of faith to everyone who feels such things. And what Rav Shagar is getting at is that if you were a religious soldier in the Yom Kippur War, you cannot help but see those experiences, those events as meaningful. But that doesn't mean that they brought this sense of sort of, like I said, simple and certain faith. He says here, but my faith, as I feel it's in the wake of the war, is not always a clear faith. What this means is that there is a shadow in it. There's darkness in it. There are perplexities in it, right? Rav Shagar is saying my faith is real still after the war, but it is not simple and it is not certain. It has darkness. It has doubts, you might even say. It has perplexities in it. He says, not only because of all those precious souls who are no longer with us, meaning my challenge here isn't simply because of the people who died. That itself, when we think about it, raises questions. But it's deeper than that, Rav Shagar is saying. It's not just about those who died, right? The difficulties of what he experienced puts everything, his whole entire worldview, to a certain extent, into question. He says, when we think about it, raises questions. But even our entire reality, our entire ideology, I mean, the religious Zionist ideology, I think there's a big question mark on this whole issue. And that people haven't dug deep, haven't observed, haven't grasped the answers to that shadow of faith. Right? For Rav Shagar, the metaphor is not faith as light, as the way we often think about it, but faith as a shadow, faith as of light with darkness, mixed into it. And he's concerned that those who think faith is certain and obvious after the war haven't really grappled with the war at all. He says, what I mean is that from the side of faith, faith doesn't weaken. Faith is still real, but don't call it light, because it has darkness. On the contrary, it becomes even more stronger, precisely because of the power of the shadow. So to reiterate, for Rav Shagar, faith is not clear. It has that shadow, it has that darkness, those perplexities. The war puts Rav Shagar's whole religious narrative into question, right? What does it mean to be a religious Zionist Jew in the wake of the war? And that story he had always told himself, and the community had told itself, Rav Shagar no longer feels like it completely makes sense for him. And that's something very profound, because he says this in public amongst other rabbis. And it takes a lot of, I would say, courage and sincerity and authenticity to say something like this in public in front of other rabbis, because this is not the easy thing for the rabbi to say, right? And a person who says this, is obviously going to be concerned at how others might respond. In another essay, Rav Shagar talks about, in the other text here, how his friends, other soldiers who survived, encouraged him after the war to do a sudat hodaya, to do a meal of gratitude. And Rav Shagar says, I just couldn't do it, right? Even if you think I'm supposed to, even if on some level I should, he says, I can't do it. He says, not because, God forbid, I reject the good, not because I'm ungrateful that I survived, but rather, he cites a verse from Tehillim, how can I sing a song to God, right? I'm not capable of doing this. Am I to have a sudat hodaya? What about my friends who did not merit to do so? Right? What about Shaya and Shmuel, who are in the tank, who died? Right? You're going to tell me I have to go and celebrate and be grateful with my whole community when they didn't come back from the war? He's like, I just can't do this, and I'm not going to. I'm not going to do this. And again, Rav Shagar recognizes that he has a different response from others. He says here, from a certain perspective, my feelings regarding my survival is different from the feelings of many others. He recognizes that he is thinking differently, that his response is different, but he's willing to, and that's not easy. And that says a lot about what makes Rav Shagar a very, very special individual, because it's always easier to offer trite religious answers to difficult questions. Rav Shagar is not willing to do that because he values truth, and truth has to be connected to real life. And as far as Rav Shagar is concerned, Havasudat Hadiyah would not be connected to real life, right? To say his faith is pure and certain and simple, like a bright sunshine, he would say like, that's not true, because that's not something that touches upon life as he's experiencing. There's a certain stubbornness to Rav Shagar, which I also appreciate. That he's unwilling to let go of difficult questions and problems. But usually when people encounter something that's very difficult or traumatic, and they're still stuck on it, right? Those people around them often feel, or they often say to themselves, or even to the person who's suffering, like, just get over it. Just like move on. Like, why are you so hung up on this, right? Like, that's what you're supposed to do when you encounter something that you don't have an answer for. You just let it go, move on, right? Rav Shagar is unwilling to do this, and it takes, like I said, a certain amount of both courage and stubbornness to be able to do that. So with this sort of challenge, the trauma and the questions that emerge, Rav Shagar is then stuck, right? Because this is going to force him to rethink just about everything. And the way Rav Shagar begins to do this, and we'll see this in the coming sessions as well, is a turn away from Rav Avram Yitzchak Cohen Kook, who is sort of the father of religious Zionism. And he's the one, Rav Kook is the one Rav Amital draws on, because Rav Kook is the father of not just religious Zionism, but Messianic religious Zionism, that the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel is bringing forth the inevitable redemption of not just the Jewish people, but ultimately the world. That kind of narrative is one that does not make sense to Rav Shagar anymore after the war. So he has to turn to a different thinker. He does not abandon Rav Kook. There are many aspects of Rav Kook he still continues to embrace. But at this point on this issue, he needs something else, somebody else. And who he turns to is Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, famous Hasidic Rebbe, great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. And what makes Rabbi Nachman, many things that make Rabbi Nachman special, if you know anything about Rabbi Nachman, but Rabbi Nachman has those same attributes that very much Rav Shagar embodied as well. Rabbi Nachman goes his own way. Rabbi Nachman blazes a trail unlike anybody else. Rabbi Nachman, more importantly for Rav Shagar, embraces contradiction, embraces, as we'll see, questions that don't have answers, and still says we can lead a passionate religious life despite those things, or maybe even perhaps because of those things. Rabbi Nachman is a thinker of contradiction. He embraces machloket, right? That there are contradictions that are irresolvable for us as religious Jews, or in our understanding of God or Torah. But that's just the way that it is. And Rabbi Nachman also did not have it easy. He was not your happy-go-lucky chassid. Other Rebbes didn't like Rabbi Nachman because he was radical. And to be honest, not every Rosh Yeshiva liked Rav Shagar because they thought he was too radical in a way that they similarly thought Rabbi Nachman was too radical. So we're not going to read this inside, but I want to just sort of summarize this core idea of Rabbi Nachman that Rav Shagar really turns to help make sense of his experiences of the war and help him rethink not just faith, but really everything. Rabbi Nachman's perhaps his most well-known and most important Torah, his most important teaching, is Likutei Moharan, Torah Samach Daled. It happens to be on Parshat Bos. It was just technically a couple of weeks ago. It is a profound teaching. It is perhaps, in my opinion, the most profound teaching of Torah I've ever come across in my life. I remember to this day where I was and how I felt when I read it the first time in yeshiva. It just kind of, blew me away. And it's not surprising that Rav Shagar would have turned to this and found something there that he desperately needed. It's a very long teaching. We can't even really go into it in too much detail, but I want to just highlight a couple of the core ideas. In the essay, Rabbi Nachman is grappling with the question, this Kabbalistic idea of tzimtzum, of God's contraction. If you know anything about Kabbalah, you might have heard this concept before. That in order for creation to come into existence, God had to do tzimtzum. God had to contract God's self to make a space for creation. So there's a whole sorts of Kabbalistic debates in Chassidut and outside of Chassidut about what exactly does this mean? Where does this idea come from? Rabbi Nachman has his own particular spin on it. And basically the question that Rabbi Nachman is dealing with is, if God is Ein Sof, if God is infinite, then how is it possible for God to engage in tzimtzum, in contraction? Because once you contract, it kind of sounds like you're no longer infinite anymore. There seems to be something paradoxical about that. And so Rabbi Nachman goes on to argue is that, yes, God is Ein Sof. God contracts God's self to make a space for creation, because in truth, there can't be creation unless there is a space that is empty of God. And when God contracts God's self, what is created first, before creation, is what is called the halal hapanui, this empty space, this void. And only in the void can the creation of the world take place, right? There has to be a space for creation before creation can happen. But that space, for it to exist, has to be empty of God, right? So there's the halal hapanui, this empty space, the void. That's where creation actually happens. But Rabbi Nachman points out, again, we're like kind of stuck in paradoxes and contradictions here. But what that means is that the world exists in a space that is empty of God, right? And that is paradoxical because, as we said from the very beginning, God is Ein Sof. God is infinite. There can't be anywhere without God. And this is the theological challenge that Rabbi Nachman is dealing with, but he says it in a very, very direct and blunt fashion. Because Rabbi Nachman is basically saying is to live in the world is on some level to risk experiencing the halal hapanui, to risk experiencing existence as a void that is empty of God. And that is not something that is perhaps, I would say, an illusion. That is something that is a reality. It is a brute theological fact of existence that to live in the world is to live in a space that has to be empty of God. But at the same time, to also know there is no space that can ever be empty of God because God is everywhere. So I know this, again, sounds like I'm speaking in contradictions, but for Rabbi Nachman, again, there's a part of reality that is empty of God, and that is where we at times find ourselves. And we say it's empty of God. Again, we have to be real here. It means we're really profoundly empty of God. There's just nothing there that would ever indicate God was real or possible. And what Rabbi Nachman goes on to say is that we encounter things that challenge our faith. Some of the things that we encounter that challenge our faith, we can find answers for. It's difficult, but it's possible to find religious answers or to construct religious answers or to be creative and be able to put at least religious language together in a way that brings meaning to those very difficult questions. But he says there's also another category of questions. And this other category of questions comes from the halal hapanui, from the void. And the questions that come from the void have no answers. They have no religious answers because God's not in the void. And those kinds of questions are the questions that can basically destroy your world, or at least destroy your world if you're a believing, person. And what Rabbi Nachman goes on to say is that you can find yourself trapped in the void, trapped in a place in which there is no God. And again, this isn't like an illusion. Like, oh, if they really had faith, they would see that they're not in the void or anything like that, right? For Rabbi Nachman, creation has the void. It's there. It's not something that's like just an illusion. You fall into it, it is real, and God is not there. And in truth, like I said, all of creation is in the void. So it becomes a profound theological challenge. Now, Rabbi Nachman does explain that it's possible to get out of the void, but the void's always there. And whatever religious story you're going to tell yourself, it has to be a story that accounts for the void, for the halal hapanui, for that space that is empty of God. Because if not, then it is not seeing the world, not seeing reality as it actually is. Rabbi Nachman is trying to conceive of religious life where the void is real and the void is possible, and we may even often find ourselves sucked within its orbits or within its gravity. You can think of it like a black hole, right? And religious life now has to make a space for that black hole, which is very, very, very difficult. And what Rav Shagar is going to struggle with, he believes in this. He's drawn to this idea because his experience in the war is the experience of the halal hapanui. It's an experience of God's absence. It's an experience of trauma, of religious meaning being eviscerated, and no religious answers can be brought to bear on it. That's why he can't express his gratitude. He can't say God was there, God saved me, because that was not his experience of the death and destruction of what took place. So the question becomes then, what is faith and what does even Torah look like in a world where the halal hapanui, where the void is a living reality for us? So I want to give you, we'll look at two ways before we close about how Rav Shagar conceives of that in the aftermath of the war. And they're both, in my opinion, just very, very powerful. The first one is about how he conceives of Torah in the aftermath of the war, where there is, like I said, this halal hapanui. What does it mean to have a Torah that also can account for the void? So one of Rav Shagar's students tells a story that Rav Shagar shared with him. And I am so grateful to this day that Elchanan retold this story, because I feel like this story captures so much about what makes Rav Shagar unique and his whole, again, what he is trying to do, what he's committing himself to. And Rav Elchanan talks about is how in the early days of his studying at Yeshivat Siach Yitzchak, it wasn't so easy for him because his father was a well-known rabbi, and a lot of his peers didn't like that Elchanan was studying at Siach, and they didn't like he was studying with Rav Shagar because, again, it was a Yeshivat Hasder, but it was a little bit off the beaten path, and Rav Shagar was seen as a little bit of a little wacky or a little bit, not heretical, but radical at the very least. And as he says here, at the beginning of my time studying at the yeshiva, one of my previous teachers ran into my father and said very harsh things about the yeshiva and its way of learning. And so Elchanan goes to Rav Shagar, he goes to his Rebbe and wants to tell him, like, what do I say to them? He says, I went to Rav Shagar and asked him why people say things like this about him. He looked at me and then at the transplanted skin on his hands and arms that he had fought in war, right? Basically, Elchanan comes to him, he says, what do I say to these people who are telling me I shouldn't be here? What does Rav Shagar do? He holds up his arms and he looks at his arms. Rav Shagar had scars all up and down his arms from the burns. And again, the skin grafts that were there. Rav Shagar looks for a moment, he thinks for a moment, then he says to Elchanan as follows. He says, I was wounded in the Battle of Nefach at the beginning of the Yom Kippur War, and I was in the hospital for many months. I was wrapped in bandages and wounded. There I understood that the Torah is wrapped in bandages, covered in infinite wrappings, and that it, like me, needed to get out of her bandages, from its constraints. Since then, I go about with this awareness and all that I learn and teach, to take the Torah out of its bandages and expose it to the sunlight. And Elchanan goes on to say, this was Rav Shagar's life project, not only to prevent the hardening of religiosity into that sort of faith that is rigid and inflexible and disconnected from life, but to renew the Torah, to reach the unique truth of Torah for our generation. So again, there's many layers to this text. We can't unpack them all right now. It's drawing on Kabbalah and the Zohar. Zohar talks about the Torah having garments. But for our purposes, Rav Shagar is saying that the Torah is covered in bandages and that those bandages need to be removed. Now, what you have to understand is that Rav Shagar, after the war, had bandages all over his arms because of his burns. And when you remove those bandages, what do you see? You see scars. So Rav Shagar is saying we have to take the bandages off the Torah so that we can actually see the scars that are there, right? If you want to have a Torah that's real to the reality that we live in with that Chalal Panui, right? And that's what a scar does. It's like a mark that like breaks the sort of wholeness of the appearance, right? That's what Chalal Panui does. Is this void that like is a rupture, a break from the wholeness, from the story we want to tell ourselves. Right? The bandages on the Torah are all those meanings that people want to impose on it. All those meanings, and again, kind of like Rav Amital, that try to make the Torah sensible and easy and comfortable and good for us. But that's not exactly what the Torah is. And we sort of have to be able to strip that away to see the Torah as it really is. Right? And if you go and look in a Sefer Torah, what you'll notice, of course, is that there's no vowels, there's no trope, and there's no punctuation. So when you look at a Torah, it's the black letters on the white parchment, and you don't even necessarily know how to read them or what it means. Even if you speak fluent Hebrew, you don't know exactly what it means because you don't know how it's punctualized. Right? There's something anxiety-provoking if you're a Baal Koreh, if you read the Torah publicly when you get up there and try to read it because you might get it wrong. But we need to be able to see it in its fullness. The Chassidut says the black fire on the white fire, the black letters on the white parchment. We have to see it, even though we recognize it doesn't make sense. It's not always comforting, and we don't always know like exactly what it means. But that's the only way to be able to read it. That's the only way we can read it halachically, right? You got to get them, read it from its Torah with vowels. A Torah with punctuation is not a kosher Sefer Torah. Maybe a Torah with bandages, but it's not the real thing. So for Rav Shagar, to have a Torah that can make a space for the void is a Torah that wears its scars, just like Rav Shagar wore his scars. And for a faith that's going to be real, it has to be a faith that also wears its scars as well. So I want to we'll conclude by looking at how Rav Shagar reconsidered faith after the war. Again, we already saw it. Faith, for him, he says it's not clear. It's got darkness. It's got shadow. It's got perplexities. And for Rav Shagar, if the traditional metaphor of faith is light, and that was certainly the metaphor Rav Kook used, Rav Kook in all of his writings uses this metaphor of orot, of lights, that the world is full of divine lights because the world is full of God, right? But as we saw, Rav Shagar recognizes that there's a black hole in the world as well. And in that black hole, there's no God. So light cannot be the primary metaphor for faith, because as he says, my faith has darkness within it too, because it's got that void. It's got that halala panui. It's got those scars. It's got those traumas. So then what can faith be if it's not light? So Rav Shagar turns to the metaphor of the sukkah, really the shade of the sukkah. If you know the war, right, the war lasted for a few weeks. So a lot of the war was fought on the holiday of Sukkot, right? From Yom Kippur to Sukkot, it's 4 days. And I think it's very powerful that Rav Shagar turns to the holiday of Sukkot to make sense of faith in the aftermath of what he experienced. So here's how he understands faith in the aftermath of the war. And he's playing on the fact here that already in the Zohar, the shade of the sukkah is referred to as the shade of faith. And the essence of dwelling in the sukkah is to be in the shade of the schach. Right? That's what the sukkah is all about, is that shade. But that's also the shade of faith. So here's how he understands it. He says, on that same Sukkot, I also said, and the words are connected to the matters of the day, that the sukkah, which symbolizes for us our trust in God, does not protect us in this world. Right? The chiddush of the sukkah, what makes it like unique, is that it's not a permanent structure. It's not a house. It doesn't have a solid roof. Right? If you go out in a sukkah, as you know, especially if you live in North America, and I grew up in New England, right? You go out in the sukkah in October or whatever, right? It's not going to protect you from just about anything. And when it rains and you're in your sukkah, you feel it. He says the sukkah is an expression of reality that is found in shade, in the shade of faith, but still nevertheless shade. Right? The sukkah is faith with the halala panui, because it is faith in which that roof's got holes in it. It doesn't protect you from the elements. It can't protect you. If there's a hurricane and you're out in your sukkah, you're going to be in trouble. If you're in a house in a hurricane, God willing, you're going to be okay. It says, we dwell in the shade of the sukkah and not its light. And the Gemara understands this. The rabbis instructed a sukkah can be very minimal, just 2 walls and a third wall. There can be just one small piece to it. The sukkah, which is for shelter and refuge, is not the sukkah of this world. If you want a sukkah that's going to protect you forever, that's the sukkah of the world to come. It's not the sukkah of the world that we live in. Person thinks that the sukkah, which is called faith and trust in God, protects them. That's what we think. Faith in God. Be a religious person. Do mitzvah. Do good deeds. Right? God's going to look out for you. Only good things are going to happen. You're not going to suffer like everybody else. But that's not the case, because faith is a sukkah, and a sukkah can't protect you from much at all. However, a person will see with their eyes that a sukkah does not protect us in the reality of our lives, and the reality that appears before us. The divine providence that exists in this world is like shade and not like light. Therefore, from this perspective, the relationship to the war is not just a relationship to pain, rather it's a relationship to Hester Panim, to the hiding of God's face, of questions, of shade, the shade of faith. Now, I know we just have a few minutes left, but I want to just try to finish this piece. And again, for Rav Shagar, faith is something that is now shade, it is now shadow, it is light that is marked with darkness. It's faith with scars. So it's shade. So what does that mean, though? What does it mean to live with that? Why would somebody want to live with that? And he says, I admit and confess, I assume there are those whose spiritual level is greater than mine. They don't get stuck in these kinds of questions. Right? There were people after the war, good-intentioned religious soldiers, who weren't bothered by all this. They could have that Sudat Hadayah after they survived and move on. But he says, but faith in my eyes cannot be derived from the repression and removal of questions. If you want faith to be real, if you want Torah to be real, as we said, if you want it to be true, it has to be something living. It has to be something connected to our lived reality. So therefore, he turns to a midrash that says, I delight to sit in his shade. This is shiurim. That's the verse in Song of Songs. It's the beloved saying to her lover, I delight to sit in your shade. I want to be so close to you. I want to dwell in your shade. So here's how the midrash understands it. Like an apple tree among the trees of the forest. That's the lover is like an apple tree. Rav Huna Rav Acha, in the name of Rabbi Yossi ben Zimmer, said, with the apple tree in which everyone flees from it in the time of heat. Why is this? Because it has no shade to sit in. God is compared to the apple tree. That's the lover. But the problem with the apple tree is it doesn't give good shade. And when it gets really hot, nobody wants to be dwelling under the apple tree. There's much better trees to be dwelling under. And the Midrash goes on to say that the nations of the world, the non-Jewish nations, if God is the apple tree, they don't want to be under the apple tree because God doesn't really provide much shade in this world, right? Not so easy to be a Jew, to be in a covenant, to have faith in God in this world. We know that from Jewish history. Non-Jews want to run away from God because you don't get much out of it in the end. But the Jews are different. The Jews, as it says in shiurim, I delight to sit in the shade. I delight to sit in it and dwell in it. It is I who delight in it and not the nations. Right? The Jews want to be in the shade, even though it's really not much shade at all. Jews want to be in the sukkah, even though it doesn't provide much protection at all. Why is this? Because it's shiurim. Because we want to be with our lover. We want to have that intimate connection with them, even if it's not easy, even if it's difficult, even if it's hard, even if we don't understand them, even if it's marked with darkness, even if it gives us wounds, even if they have wounds, right? Even if there are scars, that is still where we want to be. I delight in it and I dwell in it because that's when you love somebody, even when it's hard, even when it's brutal, like that's where you want to be. There's nowhere else in the world to be. And the fascinating thing about love is it enables you to make a space for those scars, for those darkness, for those things that are profoundly difficult. He says, just as the apple tree does not provide shade, so too it is with the Holy One, blessed be he. Sometimes the world is paradoxical. Faith is found precisely in the questions that Rabbi Nachman taught have no answers. That's where faith is. And being a faithful person, having faith in God, means you're going to have questions that has no answers. Nobody has answers to them. The greatest rabbi who's ever lived does not have answers to them. We know that. Midrash is very clear about that. Moshe Rabbeinu did not have an answer for Rav Shagar about why his friends died in the tank, and he survived. He says, God is found precisely in the broken heart. And not only in this, but the feeling of brokenness is itself the divine presence, right? Faith has to have questions. In broken, God is only present when the brokenness can be acknowledged as well, right? Because as we said, it's light with darkness. It's a Torah with scars. And I want to just conclude 1 minute here about again the scars and how even the scars in our beloved don't repel us, but actually draw us to them. And this is the difficult thing about loving somebody and being a person of having real emunah, is that even when it's impossible, we still find ourselves bound and drawn to the other. Moshe Hess, a socialist philosopher in the 19th century, one of the first proto-Zionists, he writes a collection of essays about his return to Judaism. He sort of like a Baal Tshuva. And he's trying to grapple in one of the essays with the idea of sacrifices. Because he thinks if the Jews return to the land of Israel, we're going to build a temple, there should be sacrifices. He's a modern person, doesn't like sacrifice, doesn't want sacrifices. But he says as follows. He says, you have to understand, my connection to Judaism is love. My connection to this is love. And love is a unique thing. He says, the love which dominates body and spirit alike is always blind. So what does that mean? Its blindness consists in this, that it is not the perfection and excellent qualities of the beloved, which are the object of love's desire, but the beloved's being as is. When you love somebody, you love their totality, the good and the bad, the light and the darkness, with all its good and bad traits. Love desires not the object of affection because it hopes to improve its bad traits. We don't love God so that we can make God perfect. We don't love the Torah so that we can make the Torah perfect. We love loves the undivided individual entity, like the whole person, the whole thing. The scar on the face of my beloved does not detract from my love for her, but is itself dear to me, dearer perhaps than her beautiful eyes. For her women may have beautiful eyes, but the scar is characteristic only of my beloved's individuality. If you love somebody, you love them with the scar, you may even love them because of the scar, because it helps define it as them as a real person at the end of the day. That is the kind of faith that Rav Shagar wants, this kind of Torah that Rav Shagar wants. It is ultimately fueled by an inextricable bond that he feels to God, Torah, and the Jewish people that can only be described as love. And it is what enables, again, for him, his faith to be real, even with all those questions, doubts, and darkness. So I'll end with that, and we will pick up next week, again, with some of these issues about faith and what does faith mean if it's real and what happens when faith is disconnected from life. But hopefully it begins to give you a sense of what Rav Shagar is all about.
Okay, thank you so much. Would you like to take a couple of minutes for questions or?
I don't want to keep you, Evie. I know if there's like a time issue and you got to go.
Okay, maybe we have time for one question or comment if anyone has it. We just have a couple minutes. Seems like no questions. Okay, well, thank you so much, Rabbi Truboff, and thank you so much to everyone who joined us today. Always lovely to have you with us in Drisha classes. Just a reminder that we have even more classes starting next week. You can learn more about the classes and also register on our website at www.drisha.org. So I hope to see you at more of those classes. And in the meantime, lehitraot. Okay, thank you.